Hello and welcome to Impact Exchange. I'm Richard Hall. Artificial intelligence, automation, digital transformation. These are clearly some of the hottest topics and biggest trends in contemporary business and management. But at the foundation of these exciting developments is, of course, data, and big data in particular. How that data is gathered, how it's stored, how it's interpreted by increasingly sophisticated statistical methods. What are some of the issues and implications associated with contemporary data use? Well, today, to help us unpack some of those issues, we're joined by a very distinguished visiting professor, Professor Galit Shmueli. Galit, welcome to Impact Exchange.
Thank you very much.
So what is it, if anything, that we can do as statisticians, as researchers and educators to be more culturally sensitive, I suppose, about the way in which we're using data, we're deploying algorithms, for example, and we're deploying some of these new technological advances that rely on data?
I think that's an excellent question. It's a difficult thing to approach. My personal way of learning about it, not intentionally, is by actually going and living and being part of a place is where you start to understand a little bit of what's going on. And even after you live in a place for 5 years, I've lived 5 years in Bhutan and in India, and I've lived now more than 5 years in Taiwan, you just start getting some of the ideas. So first of all, immersing in a place if you're really going to be designing some solutions for them, which is obviously not happening if you're thinking about a large company that's multinational and deploying their algorithms that were developed in San Francisco in the whole world. So that's number one. Number two is if you can't do that, then at least have some exposure to the local cultures and in some other way. Whether it's bringing over people, talking to people from there, understanding really what's going on there. I would say the flip side of this whole thing, which is tricky, is that if you understand what's going on, you can easily manipulate it. So if you look at what's happening on the political elections, manipulations everywhere, there's some countries who understand very well how other countries are working and therefore easier to manipulate. So it's very tricky. And I can tell you that this question of using powerful techniques like machine learning are a very tricky thing they were for me for a long time as a teacher. Because, I've been teaching data mining from early on. The course that I taught at Maryland in 2004 was one of these first courses taught in business schools. No. And that's why I had to develop a textbook because there were no textbooks at the time. And I kept having this nagging and uncomfortable feeling that I'm teaching a very powerful toolkit to MBA students who will be going and using it, but I'm not really sure how they will be using it. And I've carried this uncomfortable feeling with me for a long time. As I went to India, same feeling, equipping people with very powerful tools. Is, when you have a very powerful weaponry, I will even call it a weaponry, you want to make sure that the people who are using it, or you're at least giving it to, will have the notion of how these things can be used for good or bad, how they're dangerous, and they have to have a heart. That the heart has to work as strong as your brain. There's a very famous professor at Columbia University, Robert Thurman, professor of religion, and he was, I think, one of the first Western Buddhists. People know him more as being the father of Uma Thurman, the famous actress. And when I was in Bhutan, I heard him give a very interesting talk. And he mentioned something very important. He said, at Columbia University, we have the brightest minds, very bright minds, students, faculty. But what we need today, and this was 10 years ago, he said, what we need today is we need to have good hearts. So I really think that you have to have this combination of really wanting to be empathetic, really wanting to put yourself on the other side, and think about, if I'm that person who's a line in the data set, do I want to get that algorithm prediction, and how would I react? And if we don't have that empathy, it's really, really hard to think about where those algorithms are going to go.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about how you then develop the heart as well as the cognitive and technical skills at the same time. And one response to this might be, well, we need to kind of build values somehow into algorithms. Or is it possible for us to say, no, it's sufficient if we're attuning and training and teaching people in these skills, not just about the technical skills, but about values as well, or cultural sensitivity? Or alternately, do we kind of let the statisticians do their work, and then we have some other body of regulation or moderation that sits across this to kind of monitor what's going on? Do you have any views about practically how we can address this critically important issue?
Okay, I have views, but you know they keep getting updated as things are changing. One thing we know is nobody likes monitoring bodies, right? Nobody likes them. So if I say the word ethics, you know, you get a knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people. You don't get it when you talk to people who are philosophers, because for them ethics has a different meaning. But when you talk to technical people, ethics means regulation. You're going to tell me what to do now. You're telling me I'm doing something wrong. And nobody wants to hear that because we really think we're doing our best. Most people think they're doing their best. I think education in terms of values, and I don't mean, you know, just a course that says ethics, because that's a course that says ethics. I think it needs to be built much deeper into, you know, the first thing you do when you walk into the university is you take a little bit of humanities, a little bit. You know, we're forcing everyone to take programming, which is very important, but that's the other side of it, that we need to think about what it means to be human and what it means to live in a society. And it has to be done in a way that's appealing. And that's a hard thing to do, I think. But I think that's one way to go. I think the other thing to do is, you know, I guess as you get older, you have more time for, you don't have more time, but you force yourself into more introspection.
Right.
And I think introspection is a very important thing that's totally getting lost right now, because there's no, every free moment is now being used on some engagement with something else. But moments of introspection, of just feeling for a moment, or thinking for a moment, or contemplating about what just happened, or what did I just see, or what did I just do, or what's happening when I'm doing this. I think that's the other part of it. So seeing in ourselves and learning what we should be looking at.
Taking a moment to pause, to reflect on some of the implications about what we're doing and how it fits with our purpose. And if we can teach more of that and do more of that in business schools while we're charging ahead in data analytics programs, that's probably a really positive thing.
And one thing that I do, and I've been doing more and more since I'm in Taiwan, is in my courses where I teach data mining or forecasting, you know, technical courses, but there are a lot of business aspects to them. I spend dedicated time to building in the ethics where they fit in. So for example, I had about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had team proposals, and the teams are working with different companies. So companies are also, they're coming in, they're sending in the people to sit in the proposals. And after the teams propose what they're planning to do with the data and these cool, nice ideas, every team had to stand in front of their big whiteboard and write down some issues that might actually go wrong or not go wrong, or that are problematic, or if they were being the people who are going to be deployed to, what would they feel uncomfortable? So social issues, environmental issues, humanistic issues, those are things that if you start contemplating them when you're a student, then when you go to the company, at least you'll have that in your mindset. Sometimes it's very hard to change things in a company, but at least if there's a voice, sometimes the company will listen. It also means that students will seek out companies that are more positive about that. So for example, I'm working with a startup now that upfront says, we don't collect data about users because we think that's unethical. So there is a growing notion of what that means.
Yeah, surfacing those conversations, clearly absolutely critical and a key part of the training, as you say, and part of our obligations. I do want to talk a little bit more about when things go wrong or not entirely right, and what we can learn from some of those.
We're talking about these systems that will actually lead to a decision, and judicial systems that are used in the judicial systems or by police. Those are systems where they're decision support systems. They use some kind of machine learning, or AI if you want. But then there's a decision maker who gets the output and needs to make a decision. And I think those kinds of systems are different from the automated AI, like a car that needs to make a decision to turn right or left or stop. And in the decision support systems, I think there's going to be, there's already unfolding, like the example you gave now, and there's several examples that already came out earlier with judicial recidivism prediction or policing. And I've been working with colleagues, this really requires an interdisciplinary group. And it's a very slow thing to happen because we're talking with people who we have never talked before too. So for example, in the team that I've been working with, there's people from the law group, so they're lawyers, and there's also people from philosophy and data science, and we're sitting together and trying to figure out why are things going wrong, and when they go wrong, what's happening here? And of course, there are all the technical issues, and there have been lots of interesting papers about bias. They call it algorithmic bias, but it's the human's bias that gets basically coded into the algorithm, where the data come from, what data you're not training on, you're just training on some, but where are the data not getting recorded. There are all kinds of technical, I call these the technical issues, that those maybe you can tag them and name them and maybe solve some of them. But there's a whole other layer, which is a difference between concepts. You know, we say the word fairness. Fairness means something different to us that you can't really code into a specific line of code in an algorithm. There are things like, you know, when you say personalization, that's a concept. But what it's coded into in machine learning is a very specific and narrow thing. So I think there's a really big gap between what people perceive in a lot of fields that are not technical, including the legal systems and, you know, the social sciences. They use concepts. But what we do in machine learning and in statistics is we code them into something very, very specific. If you're saying someone was late, what does late mean? Late has to have a certain time duration, has to have a certain amount. We code that thing, and that now for us means late. It's a very narrow definition. So I think until we realize that there's this huge gap, and we can code things in very different ways and it will lead to very different outcomes, there will always be issues. So you have to have somewhere a human decision maker in between with all their biases and all their problems, and maybe it needs to be improved, but that person has to do the coding, the encoding between the very specific and the more humanistic, general, subjective sometimes, definitions of what we're trying to capture.
So there needs to be space for judgment in there, in the process, and some of that you're saying can be built into the algorithms and built into the systems, but some of it still requires that kind of human intervention. Your example about being late, of course, it's difficult to quantify, and it's also culturally relative. Being late, for example, like that, so we've got the added complexity of the cross-cultural sensitivity and the application in different kinds of contexts as well.
There's going to have to be a distinction between applications that are really impacting your life in a serious way, such as the example that you gave, versus the lightweight, should I get a recommendation for this restaurant or that restaurant, right? So that's also going to be a subjective decision, but at some point, you know, whether it's government says our systems are going to inflict too much pain if something goes wrong, then we're not going to have a non-human decision maker there. Or on the other hand, you know, again with technology, they say with the cars, things are going to be better because drivers are worse.
Right.
So there's going to have to be a split in what kind of decision making is going to use algorithms and to what extent. Again, issues of transparency and how people understand and perceive what's going on there is interesting. But again, you know, let's take another term that's very tricky. This word that people are saying they want, explainable algorithms. And I think the word explainable is one of the trickiest words because it means completely different things to the machine learners than it does to a person that you say an explainable thing. If you tell me that the algorithm told me I had to pay my debt now, and here's my explanation why, then I would expect you to tell me what I did wrong, okay? But an algorithm is not telling you what you did wrong. An algorithm is just telling you, oh, because we measured these things about you, and these things had these values. And had you had a different value on that, if you lived in a different neighborhood, then maybe this would be different.
Do you think that we can talk about people who are subject to these algorithms having greater rights? Is that a useful way to think about it? A right to transparency and having access to understanding what is being measured and the basis on which decisions are being made?
You need to have an ability to explain to people why a certain decision has been made about them. Again, I think that's important in some applications and less important in others. For example, when you're driving your car and it just gets stuck, you don't really want to know all the nuts and bolts of why it stopped. You just want it to not happen, and if it happens, what do you press to restart the engine? So there are applications like that, but in applications that are life-altering, where you really need to understand what is different so that you can get the feedback loop and improve, or you can say, wait, this is wrong.
That's right.
We have a notion of wrong or right. And those applications definitely will need us to be able to understand reasons. And reasons, again, are something very different than what the algorithms are using. Algorithms are using a very filtered version of data that's collected about us.
Right.
So it's already not all our behavior, it's just what's measured.
And is there a danger in that I become reducible to this kind of data package? I spend a lot of my time telling my students, you aren't your behaviours. Your identity is not defined by that. And it's sort of an important principle. And yet at the same time, we've got, it seems, this counter tendency whereby there's a danger of us becoming sort of categorised and defined by the things that can be measured about our behaviour. Do you think that represents a threat or a challenge to our identity?
It's an interesting question. When I was an undergrad, I studied statistics and psychology. And I remember in psychology, they had separate courses. There was a behavioral psychology course and there was a personality psychology course. And they were separate. So when you look at where the research is coming from, those research streams are separate. But that's just the reality. So the question is, how can we make the best out of it? We can't stop everything and turn the power down.
No, absolutely. Let's try and get a bit more optimistic and positive for a moment. I mean, surely there's great potential. I'm thinking there about using data and what we understand about human behaviour and motivation to nudge, as the terminology goes, more virtuous behaviour, more constructive behaviour, improvements in the way we live, and the way we make decisions, and the way we behave. Are you optimistic about that kind of scenario?
I am very much, and that's why I think that, again, teaching MBAs in the right way can actually lead to a lot of these startups and people working in bigger companies pushing that kind of agenda. And there are definitely companies like that, and there are definitely a lot of people like that. And I find that students are, at least my students in Taiwan, they're very receptive to this because everybody does want to do good. I think most people want to do good. They just don't realize that they have these options. So that's one thing. I think there's another part of it, and that is that when you're very focused just on predictions, which is what the industry is now, it's focused on predictions, you lose sight of why. And if you lose the sight of why things are working the way they are, it's very hard to nudge. So yeah, I can try and see that this blue color makes you click faster than that blue color. But if I don't understand why, then it's just making more money and engaging you more, but I'm not fundamentally getting into what I'm trying to understand. So there are these little whys, the little what's going to happen if I do this blue or that blue, and that's what half the things that the companies are doing are. Those are the experiments they're doing. But when you go into what researchers are doing in social sciences, again in the business school, many of the disciplines do this, they're trying to uncover mechanisms of what causes technology, or how technology will cause certain individuals or firms or communities to behave. And that's where you can bring in a lot of positive and useful research. But to do that, you really have to have a longer bandwidth. And that's why things are happening more in academia than they are in industry, because it takes longer and it takes much deeper work to do what's called causal explanatory work. Prediction, you can do algorithmic, it's faster.
What about the future? Where are we headed, do you think, in this whole field? And in particular, I guess, how can we get more multidisciplinarity to some of these problems and some of these issues? Because I've detected a couple of times we've been speaking about the potential, to bring together different traditions, even within statistics, that of the explanatory kind of world and that of the predictive world.
I've kind of been following what universities have been trying to do, and there've been some universities trying to launch out new things and try new things. From my own experience, and again, things change, so I don't know if this is still going to be relevant in 5-10 years, but from my own experience, in order to get interdisciplinary, you first have to have a discipline. So was able to do any of this, I had to learn something. And I learned, I studied statistics and psychology for my undergrad. Then I specialized. So I went for a master's in statistics and a PhD in statistics. So I knew something. And after you know something, you can start engaging with other fields. I'm a little worried about places that just start with an interdisciplinary undergraduate, because that's a general education, but you still need to specialize. After you specialize, then we can start again branching out and bringing specialized people from different places. And that's where things become interesting. That's where you sit there and you say, wow, I never knew that. And that person in front of you is an expert in that field. So you need to have an expertise in something narrow, but realize you're doing something narrow right now. You're not the only person. You're not doing it in the best way, which is what we learn to do in academia, right? This is the way to do things. You shouldn't do it that way. We're doing it this way. Understand really well why we're doing it this way. Become an expert, and then go and talk to those people. And I think that works really well. In industry, it's going to work better, because in industry, the incentives are not aligned to stay within your silo. But again, if you bring people into companies that have different backgrounds, and now we're seeing this, we're seeing that, for example, salaries of people with backgrounds in the humanities have shot up. Companies are hiring them too because they realize they need them to. How do they use them? How do they integrate them? That's a good question. I don't know. I have not been on top of that yet, but I think that that's the way to go.
Galit, I hope that your influence on business schools and universities, but also on industry and business, continues long into the future. Thank you so much for spending time with us on Impact Exchange.
Thank you very much.